For the next panel, we will shift gears, and and I think we're in the middle of shifting gears, hence all the background noise. But we'll shift gears, and we will take a look at the geopolitical effects and the long view. So again, following past practice, we will dispense with introductions and rely on the chair to shepherd the conversation and the name tags to indicate the speakers.
Our session is on geopolitical effects and the long view. So far this morning, we've discussed Charlie Hebdo as if it were an entirely homegrown phenomenon. But in fact, while it is the most sensational terrorist act in the recent past, it is one of several attacks. Some in countries that do not ban the veil, that do not have discriminatory legislation or practices. And I think it's clear that there's a bigger connection there, and this is what this panel will try to explore with you. I should explain that we were asked to, each panelist was asked to identify one question, and the plan was that each would answer his or her question in 2 minutes, and then we would have an open discussion. So, having consulted the panelists, I think that's what we'll try to do. Starting with Ron Prusen, whose question was, can a historian really add anything to a discussion of the January 7th attacks, especially since any attempt to identify geopolitical effects is going to require, by definition, speculation about the future rather than the past? Ron.
Thank you. Thank you. Quick answer, and I could do it at even less than 2 minutes, would be yes. A historian could have all sorts of things to add, but 2 minutes, I'll take it at the same time. I think, in fact, particularly in a moment where emotions, passions, anger, and so forth are particularly pressing, like this one in the aftermath of the January violence in Paris, there are things that others might miss that a historian trying to take a long view might be able to bring into the discussion. Although it was very interesting to see already in the two panels this morning that there is awareness of, there are references to deeper roots to some of the problems we're trying to discuss. But still, I think historians specialize in taking a long view, although I would want to suggest that there are at least two ways in which historians would work at a long view perception of the Charlie Hebdo and Paris violence situations. On the one hand, there's the almost cliched role of the historian in developing a long view that looks backwards in time. How did we get here, for instance? Or to put it in a slightly different way, how do the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo offices and the kosher supermarket in the Porte de Vincennes neighborhood compare to other tragedies that have involved violence and death? On the other hand, though, there is also the desire of many historians to develop a long view that looks forwards, not just backwards. What can previous experiences tell us about where we may be going next, or where we may not be going next, as the case may be? Both kinds of long view, it seems to me, if they're infused with historical sensitivity, have potential value. I'm going to give you just two examples because I'm taking the 2 minutes seriously, but hopefully there'll be opportunities to add some other examples into the discussion as it unfolds over the hour ahead of us. Two examples. If we look backwards, for instance, a historian would almost inevitably have to argue that the January 7th attacks were tragically not really a unique experience at all. and that it would be wise, as a result, to temper our understandable anger and outrage and passion with a determination to calmly reflect as we plan our responses, as we act out our responses in the weeks and months and years ahead. If we look forwards, on the other hand, a historian would also want to suggest that governments and societies have sometimes dealt badly with these kinds of tragedies, and that we would do well to learn from past mistakes in determining the actions we want to take. That we should, for instance, try to avoid, and we've heard some examples already this morning, over-reliance on both extreme security systems and military options and a minimal amount of attention or declining attention to programs and initiatives that might actually be more effective in coping with the challenges we confront. Thanks.
Thank you. Then I'll go to Arthur Epstein, whose question is, the Paris attacks show the readiness of terrorists to use any means they can to achieve their purpose. How can we deal with that kind of enemy?
So my answer to this is not actually going to be a strategic or indeed empirical reflection on what's likely to work best, but rather more of a caution about the way in which the question is framed, although I propose that there's something wrong with the way of framing it, but it's something we hear a lot of. And the reason that I want to focus on this in my 2 minutes is that a lot of the discussion is about what does and doesn't work. Ayala correctly pointed out governments tend to overreact whenever there's a crisis, though it's not clear that's limited to times of crisis. And I want to just draw everyone's attention to the importance of reflecting not merely on the ends for which we're acting, but the acceptability of the means that we're using to do so. Some of the panelists this afternoon who will be talking about the particulars of the proposed legislation will point out some of the dangers of overreaction, some of the potentially bad side effects to some of the things that are being proposed. My focus instead is to draw your attention to the fact that certain kinds of means are problematic even if they were effective, even if they didn't have excessive side effects. Canadians rightly pride ourselves on the fact that we are an open, diverse, pluralistic, and tolerant society. And sometimes we put that in terms of those being our values, as though somehow other people might have different values, and what we need to do is figure out how to get our values to win and their values not to overwhelm ours. But in fact, one of the things that's distinctive about a liberal and pluralistic society is that we don't just have particular ends that we value, but we actually recognize certain restrictions on the kinds of means that we can use. And among the restrictions that we recognize is that we, for example, never make anyone be in a position where they are presumed to be guilty. We start with ideas of a presumption of innocence. We don't have detention without trial. We don't have unrestricted surveillance without warrants. Why do we not do that? And the answer is part of what it is to have a free society is to let people figure out for themselves what ends they want to act for. And we, acting as a collective body, restrict the means that we use in order to provide for the things that Canadians value, which we used to always call peace, order, and good government. Those consist in restrictions on the means we use rather than the endorsement of particular ends. I'll stop there.
Thank
2
you.
minutes later.
Very good. And Jutta Brunet, her question is, does international law have a role to play in dealing with transnational terrorism? If so, what are the main challenges that this phenomenon poses for the international legal order, and do the Paris attacks change the nature of the challenge? Jutta?
Yes, thank you. Well, in the case of the Paris attacks, we had an event where the perpetrators as well as the victims were French nationals, and it occurred on French soil. So one might at first glance say that this really is a domestic incident and that there is not much for international law to do. But I think the Paris attacks, and they're not alone. We've seen attacks in Denmark and elsewhere that had similar characteristics. They illustrate really a shifting, a sort of shape-shifting of what we've come to know as a phenomenon of transnational terrorism. And if we think back to 9/11, large-scale spectacular attack in the world, including lawyers, had to come to grips with the fact that these attacks were staged abroad, planned, and directed from abroad, and saw foreign nationals enter the United States to perpetrate the attacks. And then in the intervening years, we've seen permutations of transnational terrorism that also involve then networks actually fighting wars on the ground, recruiting foreign nationals to participate in those fights, including nationals of Europe or North America. And now most recently, and this is the phenomenon we saw play out in Paris, we have terror networks being able, through either point people on the ground in the country in question, or simply through cyberspace, through the internet, recruit, inspire, provide manuals, how to, and so on. So we have the phenomenon of the homegrown, either lone wolf or otherwise homegrown terrorist. And all of this, I think, is fairly obvious. And it turns out, of course, that we know now that the brothers who committed the Charlie Hebdo attack declared their affiliation with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and the hostage taker in the Jewish supermarket with ISIL. So these links were there. So all of this whole phenomenon of transnational terrorism, I think, has been a challenge for international law, and especially because international law is state-centric and territorial-focused in its conceptual framework. Now, post 9/11, or immediately after 9/11, the most spectacular challenge perhaps was the long debate about the extent to which states should be able to avail themselves of the right to self-defense against non-state actors, and perhaps more complicatedly, in what circumstances they should be able to strike those non-state actors in other countries that were not necessarily directly implicated in the mounting of the attack. And then in parallel to this war framework that we still have, obviously, there's been a debate on how much we should use criminal law or other regulatory means to suppress terrorism, to cut off the staging grounds, to limit mobility, limit finances, and so on and so on. And so here, another difficulty for international law is that typically this is done through treaties. They're negotiated. It's a very long process, and then only those states that join the treaties are actually bound by them. So in the face of the frustration with that framework, what we have seen is the Security Council entering the arena. And so here now we have a body of 15 states that has the power, when it comes to threats to international peace and security, to adopt decisions that bind every single state. And not just after 9/11, but increasingly, the Security Council has been very active in doing this, and has in fact done something that you could compare to world legislation, requiring every single state to take extensive domestic measures. So I would say that what you've seen the Security Council doing has actually roughly mirrored this evolution of terrorism that I've sketched. And so the challenge then here in this instance is what is the legitimacy of a body like this to essentially impose extensive requirements on states in this way? And also, the more that these requirements directly or indirectly implicate individuals, limiting their mobility, affecting their human rights, affecting due process rights, how do we deal with this? So I guess the question that I asked myself, perhaps a leading question, does international law have a role to play? Yes, it has a role to play in moderating the visceral reaction that we want to make war on terrorism, and also in coordinating national responses, but there are many, many challenges, and as they say, it's complicated.
That's an excellent start. Can we pursue a little bit the legal dimension? When Canada decided to send military assets to combat ISIL, it chose to go only to Iraq, on the grounds that Iraq had asked for the support, but not Syria. because Syria is still a sovereign state. Is that something that, in your view, is likely to evolve in terms of a concept?
Well, that is really at the current heart of the debate concerning on what circumstances states can, without Security Council authorization, intervene in another country to combat terrorism. And so the distinction that you see here is it is okay with the consent of the country in question, and in the case of Syria, it is once again more complicated because there's been notification. Syria was notified but has not explicitly consented to those actions, and it goes to the debate on at what point can a state be treated as either unwilling or unable to deal with the difficulties, and whether we have replaced the basic idea used to be there is an exceptional right to intervene in another country if that country is about to attack you or attacking you. And what is happening is a pushing on the legal goalposts further and further back to thin that connection between the actual attackers and the country. And I would say we haven't really seen entirely how this shakes out yet, but there's definitely a shifting of the goalposts happening. And I think Ayelet made this point earlier, something that we might have resisted 10 years ago with the constant stream of attacks. There's more and more room to move the goalposts further back.
Remains to be seen whether what started as the responsibility to protect in humanitarian circumstances can be extended beyond, and it's already challenged. It's not a widely embraced concept, or it is embraced in a very superficial way. There's nothing that says that this is a real new norm, even though it was included in a summit declaration in 2005. It's still a very, very weak norm, even in the face of humanitarian disaster. So I'm not sure that there is a lot of appetite for extending this concept of responsibility to protect beyond the will of a sovereign state in cases like we observe on the ground, especially with the changing power balance in the world, where states that have been inclined to be supportive of this concept of responsibility to protect have less influence nowadays than they did 10 or 20 years ago. More broadly speaking, our response to ISIL has been, on the one hand, to try to reinforce our own legislation, protect ourselves, but it has also involved some action out there, including the deployment of military forces in support of local forces. Can we spend a few minutes to see whether you agree with that action, whether this is the proper way? What else can we do? We keep saying we need to do something, but who's the we in this case, and what's the best way? What's the best approach?
So I don't pretend to any expertise on international affairs, and I always hesitate to say anything that has happened to discuss any events less than 2 centuries old. But that said, it seems to me that there is actually an important distinction to be drawn between, on the one hand, the question of how to deal with ISIL, and on the other, the question of how to deal with threats of terrorism in our domestic context. And obviously there are connections between these two sets of events, but in the case of ISIL, we have what looks to be something like a conventional war. That is, you have a group that controls an area of territory, and they are using it in order to attempt to acquire further territory. And without saying that we really have a clear sense of what exactly is acceptable there, we know how to think about that. it's a war, and that means that there are certain kinds of distinctions that apply, distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, certain restrictions on what we can and cannot do. And the thing that's worrisome is taking our ways of thinking about war out of that kind of context and then bringing them home to the domestic context and saying, well, this is a war, and so therefore, and then the therefore is filled out with such things as, well, we need mass mobilization, we can't have the ordinary rules governing us. And I'm nervous about that in a way that it seems to me that, though I'm not sure what to do about ISIL in the particulars, I have a much clearer sense of how to think about it.
Is the distinction between combatant and non-combatants and the laws of war that clear when you're dealing with a non-state actor?
Well, one of the things about ISIL that actually makes it a little bit easier is that they are purporting to be a state, and they recruit fighters, and they actually operate in a way, although they may not wear uniforms, they nonetheless are doing business in many of the ways in which armies traditionally did business. And so, though there are always ambiguous cases, nonetheless there is at least the beginnings of some sense of the non-ambiguous case of it. And now, of course, they don't necessarily respect those distinctions, but one of the things about the law of war and indeed the morality of war is that it's not merely conventional. This isn't just something that the two sides agree to, and if one side reneges, we can therefore, if they start slaughtering civilians, that becomes okay for us. It's not okay for us. There are certain rules that are, certain acts that are ruled out, even if the other side doesn't do them. And because we end up, when there's a war, thinking that this is a dispute that is being resolved through force, but the only way we could possibly do that is if we're only using our fighters against their fighters. It's not our population against their population. And those restrictions matter a lot.
Just, I would want another element of the ambiguity here is it seems to be if we talk about ISIL on one hand, if we talk about the Charlie Hebdo case on another, if we bring in 9/11, which I think is an important historical counterpart to this, it's not 2 centuries though, but it's the difficulty, the increasing difficulty in separating what we would call domestic and international. In the United States, in Canada now, we routinely, not me, the societies, the government leaders in particular, routinely talk about war. On the domestic front, there is a war on terror in the United States since 9/11 that very much involves domestic action. Prime Minister Harper talks about the fact that others have declared war on Canada, and therefore Bill C-51 is required in order to address that. And that's a fact of life for us, certainly in the early 21st century. And it's a disturbing fact of life because it creates the opportunity for all sorts of overreactions, abuses on the domestic scene, without necessarily losing track of the possibility that there is a potential for abuse internationally as well. It's disturbing to many observers, for instance, that the most active participants in military action in North Africa and the Middle East are old imperial powers. What does that say about the nature of our response to ISIL or other situations? There is a kind of deep-seated historical grounding here in which those with power, who have had power, who want to retain power, behave in certain ways and take certain actions that may be more extreme than desirable both domestically and internationally. The 9/11 case is a very good one, although you can ground it in even deeper history. If you look at, certainly, for instance, the behavior of imperial powers in the 18th, the 19th century in repressing signs of unrest among colonial peoples, the brutality of that repression that took place. But since 9/11, and this is, to me as a historian, and this is to pick up on what Simone was saying earlier, this is the chapter I'm writing at this point. We'll talk in particular about the 9/11 episode and aftermath, and the disturbing way in which a very meaningful mix of reactions gave way to a less and less varied set of reactions over time, in which at the beginning there was very understandable anger, fury, a desire for revenge. There was a very real and understandable desire to increase security. And there was also a very real, at least very temporary, willingness to think about the root causes of violence and to do something about those. Tony Blair, before he went off the rails, as far as I am concerned at least, talked very eloquently about the need to address social and economic ills in much of the world. Barack Obama, very recently in the United States, and he's been severely criticized for it, talked about the need to address social and economic ills, to deal with the soil in which terrorist acts can grow, in which the appeal of terrorist acts can take shape. That piece of the 9/11 story disappeared very rapidly. Overwhelming attention on military and police and surveillance responses and regulatory responses to dealing with a terrorist threat felt by, of course, the United States and other countries. If I, as a historian, were going to try to take the long view forward here, I would see, unfortunately, the same pattern emerging in 2015. We have heard some, I think, admirable emphases on the need for reform. The French government policies, for instance, about reorganizing the Paris metropolitan area to pay more attention to the suburbs in which unemployment rates are 40% or more. That's there. That's an admirable impulse. It preceded the Charlie Hebdo attacks, but there's been some renewed attention to it. We've heard Obama talk about the need to address social and economic ills. But my fear is that they will go the way of what happened after 9/11, and the overwhelming emphasis will be on military action against ISIL and increased surveillance and regimentation within countries like France and Canada and, to some degree, the United States, yet again, as well.
I mean, I think it's fairly clear that the dramatic nature of the events, it's been said by many people already today, produces extreme reactions, and coupled with the rhetoric of war and that we have to go and combat the enemy, things ratchet up, and the pressures that are put on domestic systems to be more and more draconian as a result, I think, are high. But there's also the sort of frustration that it's so difficult with our existing legal frameworks, including the international legal order, to come to grips with this threat or the actors involved. And as I said in my comments, the challenges here are manifold, and partly having to do with the fact that the actors are not the kind of actors that the legal order has envisaged, or even the political order is used to dealing with and mediating. And on top of it now, I think we have this layering of dealing with the cyber dimension, which is also deterritorialized in a certain way and raises similar issues. And that combination is very difficult. I agree that the temptation then is to go after ISIL because there is something that looks like something that we can fight in the territory of a state, but it raises all the issues of the question that you posed to me. What are the longer-term implications of this? Even if we agree that we need to go there and fight ISIL now, how far do we want to let the boundaries of our legal standards slip? Because the next time around, what we've done is we've created a framework that makes it okay to hit anyone who's threatening in a certain way, wherever they may be.
We seem to be in agreement that the military instrument is one that is fraught. We've seen the results after Afghanistan and Iraq. Even with the best of intentions, you end up with a mess on your hands. And I tend to share your concern that we seem to be going more or less in the same direction. But is the answer to just back off completely? To what extent are we in the West able to do much about the root causes there? There may be root causes in our own society that we can tackle, but there are root causes over there that are generating the kind of extremism and recourse to violence that has a direct connection to some of the actions that have taken place. Is there anything that we can do to address these root causes if we don't think the military avenue is the one that we should favor?
It's complicated.
I always say the one good thing about being
My colleague, indeed, but it may be easier, and I'm just taking a slice of this. I don't pretend to have a satisfying answer. It may be easier to put the emphasis on what we shouldn't be doing and to give ourselves the breathing space, the opportunity to think about what we could do alternatively to that. We are, however, and I remember Mohammed in the first panel this morning talking about his pessimism about where we're going, and I share it. It's not built into my personality, but in this case, it's hard not to be pessimistic. We are not very good, and I use we very broadly here, not just academics in this case, but in Canada, in the United States, which is a home country for me, in Europe as well. We are not very good at taking time anymore. Maybe that's just a cranky old historian talking, but we want things done quickly, and we grow very impatient if they're not, so that and the impatience fueled by anger, it seems to be, or the anger that fuels the desire to do something quickly then turns into impatience, and we opt for the seemingly easier, the temptingly easier routes, like Bill C-51 or military action against ISIL. But over and over again, we tend to forget that it hasn't worked in the past. The Afghanistan-Iraq story after 9/11 is a horrendous story, and yet we're going to repeat that pattern. Even those who acted in it, who seem to have insights, and I'm thinking of someone like Barack Obama in this case, who seem to have insights, are going maybe reluctantly, but going down that road again. I think we've got a real impatience problem in a speeded up 21st century. The cyber component of this is no small issue. But one thing we could do is take a deep breath, think about what is required at this point.
Well, I mean, to continue on that less optimistic theme, one can even say that the reaction to 9/11 and the pushing back of the boundaries of international legal restraint on intervening abroad. So a lot of the military activity in Iraq, then the responsibility to protect under the banner of responsibility to protect intervention in Libya. A lot of the action in that area has actually contributed to what Mohammed said in the first panel, the failing, the weakness of Arab states, that one might speculate whether part of the issue that we now have on our hands is actually in part a result of the lack of restraint and the lack of the long view, if you will.
Just to turn this pessimistic note into a total downer, I'm actually not that. I share misgivings about things that have been done in the past 15 years, that they may well have made things worse. I'm actually not at all optimistic that that's the only source of problems. I think one of the problems, just to pick up on something that Ron said, is that there's a kind of impatience, but there's also a desire for decisiveness that's part of our political culture. And you're the historian, you can tell me if it's always been a part of political culture, but it's a part of our political culture. And doing something decisive is actually something that sells very well with voters, and understandably enough. But that means that there's a lot of doing decisive things, whereas I don't think anyone really has a clear sense of the root causes of terrorism. There's so many different factors. There's certainly things that exacerbate existing problems. But doing something about the root causes is not decisive. It would not bear fruit immediately. You want a result. You think of George Bush landing his plane on the aircraft carrier and declaring victory. And or indeed the troops pulling down the statue of Saddam Hussein. This is a great symbolic moment around which people can rally that is decisive but ineffectual. And what we need, and this is why I say it's a downer, is something that's effective rather than decisive, and I have no idea what that is.
I would just add, I completely agree. I study American politics, American foreign policy primarily, and the frequency with which Americans reflect a desire for strong leadership is a constant. It's certainly been there for much of the 20th century, with the occasional downturns in the importance of that. It begs the question of, what's the strong leader going to do? And, we have an example like George W. Bush, in which strong leadership was terrible leadership simultaneously. But to pick up on just a hint of something that was in what Louise was talking about before, one of the things I would argue, at least, that we could be doing at this point is turning inward to solve serious social and economic ills at home. Before we pose ourselves and intrude ourselves as the solvers of problems everywhere else in the world. This is true in Canada and the United States. The Canadian record in dealing with Aboriginal populations is terrible and remains terrible at this point. The Canadian record of dealing with people with disabilities is terrible and needs to be improved. But we except for the occasional study and commission, Paul Martin recently, for instance, we have a knack for ignoring that. The American experience with dealing with deep-rooted racism and ethnic tensions and the declining middle class and the state of American cities is terrible. One could imagine turning some of the energy devoted to global issues inwardly to develop some credibility, frankly, about the ability to solve these problems.
I'm really torn because on the one hand, I really do not believe that the West holds the key to solutions of problems, multiple problems in the Middle East, that the solutions will come from there. On the other hand, I'm a little leery about denying any role to outside forces, and I think the circumstances are particularly troubling because there is growing tension within the international community. I mean, the festering conflict in Syria, I'm not sure it could be resolved if the large powers all were in agreement, but it would be worth a shot if the Russians and the Americans and the other influential powers of the region saw eye to eye and dealt with the Syrian regime. I think there might be a better chance of this horrible conflict coming to some form of conclusion. I think there's been a real failure of political action. In my mind, the alternative to the military intervention is not necessarily isolationism, where we all go back to our own internal problem, but I think to put much more of a premium on political action. And political action nowadays is not on the basis of bright ideas hatched in NATO or among Western countries.
It's an oxymoron.
Yes, but political actions that reach out to a broader, more diverse community of countries and leaders who can help. You know, there is such thing as mediation of conflict that occasionally do produce a path towards resolution, and I'd like to see more of that happening. I don't know whether you have any reaction to this alternative to looking after our own problems. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had a career.
No, and before Arthur and you to step in, I was absolutely oversimplifying. I couldn't agree more. To suggest paying attention to our own problems, for me, is one component of a more wide-ranging program. And I think isolationism, at least as an old-fashioned and easily distorted term, would be a foolish way to go. Certainly a very incomplete way to go. I would just also add, I've spent some time in Brazil, for instance, in recent years for the monk school, and the Brazilian concept of variation on the responsibility to protect notion of responsibility while protecting is a very interesting one in terms of suggesting something that goes beyond the need to go beyond the military steps. That I think I couldn't agree more with you. Yeah.
Well, I think, again, the challenge is that absolutely yes, and there has to be engagement and there has to be actual listening to one another and building up common ground, but that is difficult, especially in charged circumstances like this. So in some sense, one might say that the military option poisons the well in which this kind of thing could happen. And it also, once again, the difficulty is that it is something that isn't necessarily going to, or very unlikely to, deliver short-term results, and the push for some sort of action and decisiveness is often stronger. Another dimension here that's perhaps interesting is when you read the literature about transnational terrorism, you would find some people saying that the international response, the combination of the use of force and the Security Council response, has actually been quite effective in choking off, say, the bin Laden-style network that stages somewhere and then strikes abroad. But then what that has prompted is what we see now. You see ISIL looking for territory, that it takes advantage of the vacuum in the region, the failure of different degrees of the states concerned, the lack of control over parts of their territories, to create a space within which not just some alternative state can be created, but also a staging and recruiting and training ground is generated. And then the even more pervasive problem that we now face of it being apparently relatively simple to disseminate information and guidance and inspiration. There's actually, I learned in reading for this event, a magazine called Inspire that is put out by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. That is a glossy PDF magazine on the internet. I did not dare to actually access it to look at it because of the cyber issue. Who knows where that would get me? But it gives engaging stories about what it means to be a fighter for Islam and how to make a bomb in your mom's kitchen and so the threat has gotten more, or the difficulties of the phenomenon has gotten more diffuse and even harder to handle, and this is the sort of thing that military clearly cannot deal with. And I guess it does come back to what are we going to do domestically that is more than suppressing, penalizing, banning, and so on.
So I don't think I have much to add again. other than adding to the pessimism. So obviously, any way in which a dispute can be resolved without force is superior to its resolution through force. But that said, you really need to not merely get the parties to the dispute willing to talk, which is not easy to do with a group like ISIL, but you also, of course, need to get all of the parties doing business with them, selling them weapons and so on side. And I'm not saying that that's impossible, but that makes it a very big task. And on the domestic side, it's clear that no military effort is going to help with that, and it's also not exactly clear what will help. Again, there are certain causes of frustration and so on. There are certain ways of making the situation worse, which are not the same as solutions to it.
Any final word?
Well, I would just, in terms of the long view, it does seem to me that it is important to reflect on speaking for my discipline, reflect on the impact of our gut reactions on the legal framework that we rely on in the longer term. So fundamentally, it's a framework that wants to restrain interventions abroad, and that, I think, is a good and wise framework to have. And so I think we do need to remain vigilant, and the distinction that you brought up between what's going on in intervening in Iraq and then intervening in Syria, I think is a really important one. It's sort of gone under the radar screen because there's all this noise, there's all the concern, and more people, the slippage just happens while we don't watch. And the same thing with respect to allowing large-scale standard setting by a body like the Security Council. There is, of course, pushback, that national courts have pushed back against what the implications of the Security Council resolutions are for people's ability to move money or move themselves across border and so on. And the UN system itself has also seen a number of reforms, but every time that something like Paris happens, there is another push that goes a little beyond what was seen to be acceptable the last time around, and I think it's just important that we continue to talk about it and understand and hopefully have actually a shared understanding around the world, I don't know, that framework is there for a reason, and it's served us well.
Thank you.
I would just, one variation on the theme, maybe a minor as opposed to a major variation, in which I'm going to risk sounding optimistic, and I'm not sure I want to do that, but I'll risk it. I was thinking of a variation in which, that is, the passage of time, a different kind of long view perspective. Might be at least a bit encouraging. I was thinking of it in connection with the overview we had at the very beginning today of the Angus Reid poll results, and thinking that it would conceivably be much more than coincidental that the response within Canada, for instance, to something like Bill C-51 is a direct outgrowth of, the shooting on Parliament Hill and the Charlie Hebdo Paris attacks at this point, and that 1 year from now, again, and we should do this a year from now, the response may be calmer.
But in the meantime, the laws are going to be on the books.
This is why I'm risking sounding optimistic, because but I think it's an interesting dynamic in which passions rise and passions fall. But you're also absolutely right. The moment you have another episode like the Paris attacks, you not only have had the laws change, but you have public passions and political opportunism, which I think Arthur was referring to, that I would absolutely see as well, kicking in and playing their role again as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Since there's a few minutes, I will give it to myself, if you allow. First, to say that the Charlie Hebdo event is a crucial moment for the West. I think it has had a huge impact, not only in France, but in Western countries in general, and is provoking all kinds of responses. I don't think it's a game changer for what's happening out in the Middle East. In a sense, it got mixed reviews in the Middle East and in Muslim countries generally because of what Charlie Hebdo stood for. There were a lot of discussions earlier this morning. So when we take Charlie Hebdo as the reference, we take a very Western-centric view of the issue. Secondly, I would like to echo the concern that you've expressed on the framework of norms. What's happening with ISIL is one particular manifestation of a challenge to our mental set of norms and rules of behavior. But I think there's a bigger context that is going to turn out to be very challenging over the coming years because precisely of the changing nature of political relationships, power relationships around the world. The set of norms that we've developed, the institutional basis that we have in the United Nations and in other such institutions are by and large reflective of a very Western vision of how the world should work, the rules that should apply to relations among countries. As the world evolves very rapidly, I certainly have questions as to whether the same norms and values will endure in the longer term. Secondly, there are new phenomena that I think require that we have another look at the existing norm. There are voids now. There are huge areas of international law that do not adequately respond to, I don't think, drones, for instance. What's the international norm for the use of armed drones? I'm not sure. You could probably indirectly connect it to something that exists. Cyber attacks, same thing. I think there will be other challenges to norms that will have to be addressed resulting from climate change. And we're faced with new realities in a moment of great uncertainty as to the role that various types of countries want to play. I wish countries like Brazil, countries like India, were more involved in the definition of the response of the world to problems like ISIL. But the fact is, these are countries that are whose influence is rising, but are still very reluctant to engage as equal partners and to take on responsibilities. And as a result, the United States, I'm not sure, wants to get involved that much, but this is where the world is turning to because they're very much in demand. There's a lot of contradictory calls on the U.S. At the same time as they have less ability than they had 25 years ago to call the shots. So I think we are in going through a period of great uncertainty. I must say that the greatest merit of my being retired is that I no longer have to advise government on what's the best course to follow. And certainly in the aftermath of Charlie Hebdo, I'm not sure what I would recommend to them. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much to all our panelists from this morning. So we will be taking a break now for lunch. We'll reconvene at 1:20, and we'll have panels this afternoon on media and more of a focus on Canada and its reactions on with its law on security. A reminder that the hashtag is #AfterParis. This event is being live streamed, so the more contemporary tweets go out, we'll get more attention, I'm sure, online, both now and later. So thanks very much again to the panelists, and we will see you all at 1:20. Thanks.